They told Catherine the rules before they told her the name. The man across the table never smiled. He wore a charcoal suit that looked expensive enough to pay off a hospital wing, and his eyes never blinked while he spoke. "You will enter the residence," he said calmly. "You will treat the patient. You will speak only when necessary." He slid a sheet of paper across the table. 3 rules were typed neatly. You do not ask questions. You do not wander the estate. You do not contradict Mr. Rossi. Catherine stared at the final line, Mr. Rossi. Even the name felt dangerous. The man across from her continued. You administer medication, change bandages, monitor infection. You will be paid $25,000 per week. Catherine's fingers tightened around the cheap plastic cup of coffee she had been holding. $25,000. That was more money than she made in 4 months working night shifts at the public hospital. Why so much? She asked quietly. The man studied her. Because no nurse has lasted a week. The air in the room went still. Catherine forced herself not to react. What happened to them? His tone made it obvious he was lying. Catherine looked down at the contract again, her father's hospital bill sat folded in her pocket like a weight. 3 surgeries, 2 months of dialysis. Insurance had covered almost nothing. Debt collectors had started calling 3 days ago. They were polite at first. Yesterday they stopped being polite. She lifted her head. What kind of patient is he? The man leaned back in his chair. The kind who doesn't enjoy being told what to do. And if I do my job, you will be paid. And if I break a rule, the man's voice softened. You won't. Silence stretched across the table. Catherine picked up the pen. She signed. 2 hours later, a black car arrived. The driver never spoke. They left the city behind. Streetlights disappeared. Concrete turned into winding mountain roads. Rain fell in slow sheets across the windshield. After 40 minutes, the car approached a gate. Not a normal gate. This one looked like the entrance to a fortress. Steel bars. Security cameras. Armed guards. The driver rolled down the window. The guard leaned inside, looked at Catherine, then nodded. The gate opened slowly. Beyond it stood a mansion carved into the side of a cliff overlooking the ocean. Cold glass. Sharp angles. No warmth. Just power. Catherine swallowed. What did I just sign up for? She whispered. The driver finally spoke. For survival. Inside the mansion, the silence felt heavy. Marble floors, dark wood walls, security cameras everywhere. The man who had interviewed her stood waiting in the foyer. Miss Catherine, he said. I'm Victor. He gestured down a hallway. Follow me. They walked past several armed guards. No one spoke. Victor stopped outside a tall black door. Before you enter, he said calmly, you should understand who you are treating. Catherine nodded. Victor opened the door. Thomas Rossi. The name hit the air like thunder. Catherine froze. Even people who avoided the news had heard that name. Thomas Rossi. The man rumored to control half the ports on the eastern coast. A man prosecutors had tried and failed to convict for 15 years. A man witnesses refused to testify against. A man enemies disappeared around. The most feared mafia boss in the region. Victor watched her carefully. You can still leave. Catherine looked down the hallway. She thought of the hospital bills. Her father lying weak in a bed. Debt collectors waiting. Then she looked back at the door. I'm a nurse, she said. Victor opened it. The room inside was dim. Rain tapped softly against tall windows. The scent of antiseptic filled the air. In the center of the room stood a bed, and beside it sat a man. Thomas Rossi. He looked nothing like the rumors. Rain tapped softly against tall windows. The scent of antiseptic filled the air. In the center of the room stood a bed, and beside it sat a man. Thomas Rossi. He looked nothing like the rumors. He was younger than she expected. Mid-30s. Dark hair, sharp jawline, broad shoulders. But what made Catherine stop walking were his eyes, cold, calculating, predatory, a bandage wrapped around his ribs beneath a half-buttoned shirt. A gun rested on the table beside him. He watched her like a wolf studying something unfamiliar. "You're the new nurse." His voice was calm, low, dangerous. Catherine nodded. "Yes." Thomas tilted his head slightly. "You look smaller than the others." Catherine set her medical bag down. "Pain level?" Thomas smiled faintly. "Interesting." He leaned back in the chair. "You didn't ask who I was." "I already know." "And you still came." "Yes." Thomas studied her a long moment. Then he spoke again. "You read the rules?" "Yes." "Good." His voice dropped slightly. "Then you know not to contradict me." Catherine opened her medical bag. "Lift your shirt." The room went still. Thomas blinked once. Slowly. "You didn't ask permission. You're bleeding through the bandage." Another pause. Thomas laughed quietly. "You're bold." Catherine pulled on gloves. "You're infected." The smile vanished from his face. "Careful." But Catherine was already examining the wound. The stitches had torn. Redness spread across the skin. "He had a fever." "You should be in a hospital," she said. Thomas's eyes hardened. "I hate hospitals." "You might hate dying more." Victor, standing near the door, stiffened slightly. No one spoke to Thomas Rossi like that. Thomas stared at her. Seconds passed. Then he leaned forward slowly. "You're breaking Rule 3. Catherine looked up. "What's Rule 3? "You don't contradict me." Catherine tightened the new bandage, then changed the rules. The room went silent. Victor's eyes widened. Thomas Rossi had a reputation for killing men who raised their voices at him. But Catherine hadn't raised her voice. She simply continued working. Thomas watched her, really watched her. No fear in her hands, no trembling. Just calm concentration. "Why are you here?" he asked quietly. Catherine didn't look up. "To keep you alive. And why does that matter to you?" She finished the bandage and stepped back. "Because dead patients don't pay." Victor coughed softly to hide a laugh. Thomas stared at Catherine another long moment. Then something unexpected happened. He nodded. "Fine." Victor blinked in surprise. Thomas leaned back in his chair again. "You can stay." Catherine gathered her instruments. "Good." Thomas watched her walk toward the door. Then he spoke again. "Nurse." She stopped. "Yes." "Don't get comfortable." Catherine glanced back at him. "I don't." Thomas smirked slightly. "Good. Because neither of them realized something yet. The bullet that nearly killed Thomas Rossi had been fired by someone inside his own house. And by stepping through that door, Catherine had just walked directly into the center of a war. Morning arrived slowly over the cliffside mansion. Gray light crept across the ocean first, then climbed the walls of the estate like cautious fingers. Catherine had barely slept. Her room was elegant, larger than her entire apartment back in the city, but the silence felt heavy, unnatural, the kind of quiet that belonged to places where dangerous men lived. She sat at the edge of the bed, tying her hair into a tight knot. Her mind replayed the same thoughts again and again. Thomas Rossi, the most feared crime lord on the eastern coast. And now he was her patient. She looked down at the folder Victor had given her the night before. Medical notes. Bullet wound through the lower ribs. Surgery performed privately. Complications from infection. Risk of sepsis. If he moved too much, the internal stitches could tear. And judging from the man she met last night, he moved whenever he wanted. Catherine closed the folder. "Great," she muttered. "Stubborn billionaire gangster with a death wish." She grabbed the medical kit and walked toward the hallway. Guards stood outside the main corridor now. 2 men in black suits with earpieces. Both carrying weapons, one of them nodded slightly when she approached. "The boss is awake," he said. Catherine nodded and continued walking. The double doors to Thomas's room were open. Inside, he was already sitting up in bed. A laptop rested on his knees. 3 phones lay on the table beside him. Victor stood near the window, speaking quietly into an earpiece. Thomas looked up when Catherine entered. His eyes scanned her once. Then he smirked faintly. "You came back." Catherine placed the medical tray on the table. "You're still alive." Victor ended his call and stepped aside. Thomas leaned back slightly. "Disappointed?" "I haven't checked the wound yet." Victor nearly smiled. Thomas's gaze followed Catherine as she approached. "You always this cheerful in the morning?" "Only with difficult patients." "Careful," Thomas said softly. That sounded like criticism. Catherine ignored him. "Lift your shirt." Thomas didn't move. "Ask nicely." Catherine crossed her arms. "Lift your shirt." The room went quiet. Victor looked between them. Thomas slowly raised one eyebrow. "You're breaking Rule 3 again." "Rule 3 is stupid." Victor inhaled sharply. Thomas watched Catherine. A long pause filled the room. Then he chuckled quietly. "You're either fearless," he lifted his shirt, "or suicidal." The bandage underneath was stained dark red. Catherine's expression hardened immediately. "Did you move last night?" Thomas shrugged. "Maybe." "You tore the stitches." Victor stepped forward. "Boss, we told you." Thomas raised a hand. Victor stopped speaking instantly. Catherine peeled back the bandage carefully. The wound was worse than yesterday. Inflamed. Hot. Angry red lines spreading across the skin. "Infection is getting worse," she said quietly. Thomas didn't react. Catherine grabbed antiseptic and fresh gauze. "You should be on bed rest." "I have work." "You're bleeding." "I've been bleeding for 15 years. "That doesn't make it healthy." Thomas watched her closely while she cleaned the wound. Her hands were steady, precise, professional. "You're not scared of me," he observed. Catherine shrugged slightly. "You're injured." Victor shifted uncomfortably. Thomas's voice lowered. "That's not the same thing." Catherine finished wrapping the bandage. "Take the antibiotics." Thomas glanced at the pills. "No." Victor closed his eyes briefly. Catherine blinked. "What?" "I said no. You need them." "I don't like medication. Medication isn't supposed to be liked." Thomas leaned forward slightly. "You're contradicting me again." Catherine stared at him. "You're being irrational." Victor quietly stepped closer to the door. He had seen this before. People who pushed Thomas Rossi too far rarely finished the conversation. Thomas's voice dropped lower. "Say that again." "You're being irrational." Silence. Victor braced himself. Thomas stood up slowly. He was taller than Catherine by almost a foot. Even injured, he looked dangerous. He stepped closer. Close enough that Catherine could feel the heat radiating from his body. "Every nurse before you," Thomas said softly, "learned something quickly." "What?" "They learned not to challenge me." Catherine met his eyes. "Every nurse before me probably watched patients die." The tension in the room snapped tight. Thomas studied her face, waiting for fear, but Catherine didn't step back. She picked up the antibiotic pills and held them out. "Take them." Thomas's eyes narrowed slightly. "Or what?" Catherine tilted her head. "Or you'll die." Victor's heart nearly stopped. Thomas stared at her for several seconds. Then something strange happened. He laughed. Not a short chuckle. A real laugh. Victor had worked for him 8 years. He had never heard that sound before. Thomas shook his head slightly. "You're unbelievable." Catherine didn't lower the pills. "Take them." Thomas looked down at her hand, then back at her face. Then, slowly, he took the pills. Victor blinked. Thomas swallowed them with water. then leaned back against the table. "Congratulations," he said calmly. "You're the first person in this house to win an argument with me." Catherine shrugged. "I wasn't arguing." Victor muttered under his breath. "You absolutely were." Thomas smiled faintly. Then he sat down again. "You're different." Catherine began organizing the medical tray. "How? You don't look at me like the others." How did they look? Terrified. Catherine thought about that. Then she said something unexpected. "You look more tired than terrifying." Victor coughed violently. Thomas froze, then slowly leaned forward again. "Careful, nurse." That sounded like honesty. The room went silent again. Thomas studied her face carefully. "You see too much." "That's my job." Thomas leaned back. "And what else do you see?" Catherine glanced at the monitors beside the bed, then at the wound, then back at him. "You're not worried about the infection." "No. You're worried about whoever shot you." The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. Victor's head turned slowly toward her. Thomas didn't speak. Catherine continued calmly. The bullet trajectory came from close range. Victor's eyes widened slightly. Catherine wiped her hands, which means the shooter wasn't far away. Thomas's voice became very quiet. "Go on. You were inside your own property." "Yes, and your security system is extreme." "Yes, so whoever shot you," she paused, "was already inside the house." Victor looked at Thomas. Thomas looked at Catherine. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Then Thomas asked one question. "Who told you that?" "No one." "How did you know?" Catherine shrugged. "I pay attention." Thomas leaned back slowly. Something had changed in his eyes. Not anger. Interest. Deep, calculating interest. "You're not just a nurse," he said quietly. "I am." "No." Thomas said, "You're something else too." Catherine closed the medical kit. "I'm someone who doesn't like unsolved problems." "And you think you can solve mine?" Catherine looked him straight in the eye. "If someone inside this house tried to kill you," she paused, "then they're probably still here." Victor swore under his breath. Thomas Rossi didn't move, but something cold settled behind his gaze. Because Catherine had just spoken a truth everyone else was afraid to say. The traitor was inside the house. And for the first time since the shooting, Thomas Rossi believed someone might actually help him find them. He watched Catherine walk toward the door. "Nurse?" She stopped. "Yes?" Thomas's voice was calm again. "Stay close to me." "Why?" "Because if you're right," his eyes darkened, "then you're in danger too." Catherine thought about that. Then she nodded once. "Good thing I'm stubborn." Thomas smiled faintly. "Yes. Yes, it is." Neither of them realized yet that within 48 hours, someone in this house would try to kill them both. And Catherine Mitchell would break far more than just the rules. By the third day, Catherine realized something about the Rossi estate. Nothing here was normal. The mansion itself was quiet, almost peaceful during the day. Sunlight poured through glass walls overlooking the endless gray ocean. The rooms were immaculate. Staff moved through the halls like ghosts, efficient, silent, careful not to speak unless spoken to. But beneath that calm surface lived tension, the kind of tension that felt like a storm waiting just beyond the horizon. Guards had doubled since Catherine arrived. They patrolled the corridors more frequently. Phones rang in hushed corners. Victor spent hours locked in the security room downstairs. Something was coming. Even without understanding the criminal world, Catherine could feel it. And Thomas Rossi could feel it even more. He had stopped pretending to rest. Instead, he worked from his bedroom command center, surrounded by monitors and files, shipping manifests, bank transfers, satellite maps of the harbor. Catherine changed his bandages twice a day. Every time she did, she noticed the same thing. Thomas wasn't afraid of the people outside the house. He was watching the people inside it. One evening, the sky darkened early. Heavy rain rolled in from the sea, hammering against the mansion windows. Catherine finished preparing the evening medication tray and walked down the hallway toward Thomas's room. The guards outside the door stepped aside. Inside, Thomas was sitting in a chair near the window. He wasn't working. He was watching the storm. "You should be in bed," Catherine said. Thomas didn't look at her. "You sound like my grandmother." "I'm serious." "You're always serious." Catherine placed the tray on the table. "You're running a fever again." Thomas sighed. "That's inconvenient. You're not resting enough." "I'll rest when the problem is solved." Catherine began checking the bandages. "What problem?" Thomas finally looked at her. "The one you pointed out." "The traitor?" Thomas nodded slightly. "I have 47 people working on this property. And you trust how many of them?" Thomas thought for a moment. 3. That's not comforting. It's reality. Catherine adjusted the IV line. "You're assuming the person who shot you is still here." "They are." "How do you know?" "Because they haven't tried again." "That means they're waiting." "Yes." Catherine studied him. "And you're letting them." Thomas's lips curved faintly. "I'm hunting them." Before Catherine could respond, Victor entered the room. "Boss." Thomas looked up. "Report." "Security feeds are clean. No outside movement." Thomas nodded. "Inside?" Victor hesitated. "Still investigating." Catherine noticed the tension immediately. "What?" Victor glanced at her. "Nothing." Thomas held up a hand. "Say it." Victor exhaled slowly. "One of the night guards is missing." The room went still. "How long?" Thomas asked. 2 hours. "And no one noticed?" Victor shook his head. Thomas's eyes darkened. "Find him." Victor nodded and left. Catherine looked back at Thomas. "That's not good." "No." "You think he's the one?" Thomas shrugged slightly. "Either he's the traitor," his voice dropped colder, "or he's already dead." Later that night, the mansion finally went quiet. Most of the lights had been turned off. Rain continued falling outside. Catherine lay in bed staring at the ceiling. She couldn't sleep. Too many things were wrong. The missing guard. Thomas refusing to rest. The strange tension in the house. Her instincts told her something was about to happen. After another hour, she gave up. She slipped out of bed and stepped into the hallway. The corridor was dimly lit. Most guards had rotated outside. She walked quietly toward the kitchen to get water. As she passed the downstairs library, she heard voices. Low, urgent. She froze. Someone was inside. "Tonight," a man whispered. Catherine slowly moved closer to the door. "Security rotation changes at midnight." Her heart started pounding. Another voice answered. "Rossi won't expect it." Catherine felt ice slide down her spine. "What about the nurse?" A pause. Then the first voice said something that made her blood run cold. "Kill her too." Catherine's breath caught in her throat. "The boss trusts her." The second voice said, "That makes her dangerous." Silence followed. Then the first voice spoke again. "We move in 30 minutes." Catherine stepped back slowly. Her mind was racing. Someone inside the house was planning to kill Thomas. And her. She turned quickly and started down the hallway, but before she reached the stairs, a floorboard creaked behind her. Catherine froze. A voice spoke softly. "Miss Catherine." She turned. One of the night guards stood there. Tall, broad shoulders, cold eyes. "The same guard Victor said was missing. Couldn't sleep?" he asked calmly. Catherine forced a nervous smile. "Just getting water." The guard studied her face carefully. "You heard something, didn't you?" Her heart hammered in her chest. "No." The guard took a step closer. "Yes, you did." His hand moved toward his jacket. Catherine realized what was about to happen. She turned and ran. The guard swore and lunged after her. Footsteps thundered down the hallway. Catherine sprinted toward Thomas's room. Her lungs burned. The guard gained ground quickly. He was faster, stronger. She reached the door and slammed it open. Thomas! Thomas Rossi was already standing, gun in hand. The guard appeared behind her. Thomas fired, the gunshot exploded through the room. The guard collapsed instantly, dead before he hit the floor. Silence followed. Catherine stood frozen in the doorway, her chest rising and falling rapidly. Thomas lowered the gun slowly. What happened? Catherine struggled to breathe. They're coming. Thomas stepped closer. Who? The traitor. Where? Library. Thomas grabbed his radio immediately. Victor. Victor's voice answered instantly. Yes, boss. Code red. Victor went silent for half a second. Then, understood. Thomas turned back to Catherine. How many? I heard 2. Thomas nodded slowly. Then there are more. He tried to kill me. Yes. Thomas looked down at the dead guard, then back at her. You saved my life. Catherine shook her head. I just overheard them. That's enough. Footsteps thundered down the hallway as Victor and several armed guards rushed in. Victor stopped when he saw the body. Damn! Thomas pointed toward the library. 2 conspirators confirmed. Victor nodded sharply. Moving now. The guards stormed out. Thomas walked to the door and locked it. Then he turned back toward Catherine. For the first time since she met him, he looked worried. You should never have heard that conversation. Catherine swallowed. Too late now. Yes. Thomas studied her carefully. You understand what this means. What? You're part of this now. Catherine glanced at the gun in his hand, then at the body on the floor, then back at Thomas. I figured. Thomas stepped closer. His voice dropped to a quiet promise. Stay near me tonight. Why? Because whoever betrayed me, his eyes turned colder than Catherine had ever seen, won't stop until one of us is dead. Outside, thunder rolled across the ocean, and deep inside the mansion, the hunt had just begun. The mansion changed in seconds. One moment, it had been quiet. The next, it became a battlefield. Alarms began blaring through the corridors, a deep mechanical howl that echoed across the marble floors. Red emergency lights flickered along the walls. Victor's voice crackled through the intercom system. Security lockdown. All units report. Repeat lockdown. Doors slammed. Men shouted orders. Catherine stood frozen near the doorway while 2 guards dragged the dead traitor out of Thomas's room. Thomas Rossi, however, looked completely calm. Too calm, he walked to a wall panel and pressed a code. Hidden compartments slid open, revealing rifles and ammunition neatly stored behind polished wood. Catherine stared. You keep an armory in your bedroom. Thomas grabbed a shotgun and checked the chamber. You'd be surprised how often it comes in handy. Victor rushed back into the room. Boss. How many? Thomas asked. Victor's jaw tightened. At least 6 inside the house. Catherine's stomach dropped. How did they get past the gates? Victor glanced toward the hallway. They didn't. Thomas's expression hardened. Inside help. Victor nodded. Catherine folded her arms tightly across her chest. So the traitor wasn't alone. No, Thomas said quietly. Not even close. Another burst of gunfire echoed from downstairs. The sound vibrated through the floor. Catherine flinched. Victor turned toward Thomas. They're heading toward the east corridor. Thomas grabbed a Kevlar vest and slipped it on despite the bandages under his shirt. Catherine stepped forward immediately. You can't do this. Thomas looked at her. Do what? Run into a gunfight with torn stitches and a fever. Thomas smirked faintly. You're still thinking like a nurse. That's because I am one. Victor cleared his throat awkwardly. Boss! Thomas ignored him. If I hide in this room, They burn the house down and shoot everyone inside. Catherine hesitated. He wasn't wrong. Thomas loaded shells into the shotgun. So unless you have a better idea? He looked at her. This is happening. Another round of gunfire erupted downstairs. Closer this time. Victor checked his pistol. They're moving fast. Thomas turned toward Catherine. Stay here. No. Catherine grabbed the medical kit from the table. If you get shot again, someone needs to keep you alive. Victor almost laughed in disbelief. Thomas studied her carefully. You realize people are trying to kill me. Yes. And you still want to stand next to me. Catherine met his eyes. You hired a nurse. Thomas smiled slightly. Fair point. He handed her a small pistol. Catherine stared at it. I don't know how to use this. Point and pull the trigger. That's not reassuring. Thomas stepped closer. Hopefully you won't need it. Victor opened the door carefully. The hallway lights flickered. Smoke drifted from somewhere downstairs. Ready, Victor said. Thomas nodded. Let's end this. They moved quickly through the corridor. Thomas led. Victor and 2 guards followed. Catherine stayed behind Thomas, clutching the pistol with uncertain hands. Gunshots echoed again. A guard around the corner shouted, "Movement!" Thomas fired first. The shotgun blast thundered through the hallway. A man screamed. Catherine ducked instinctively as bullets slammed into the wall beside them. The guards returned fire. The hallway filled with smoke and deafening noise. Catherine's ears rang. Someone grabbed her arm. "Stay low!" Victor shouted. Thomas advanced despite the chaos. He moved like a man who had done this many times before. Calm, precise, deadly. Another attacker appeared at the far end of the corridor. Thomas fired again. The man dropped instantly. Silence followed. Victor stepped forward and checked the bodies. 3 down. Thomas's breathing had grown heavier. Catherine noticed immediately. You're bleeding again. Later? No. Now. Later. Catherine grabbed his arm firmly. You'll collapse if you keep pushing. Thomas looked down at her hand gripping his sleeve. For a moment the hallway went quiet again. Even Victor watched carefully. Then Thomas sighed. 2 minutes. Catherine opened the medical kit quickly. She replaced the soaked bandage while the guards watched the corridor. Thomas didn't flinch once. You're insane, Catherine muttered. Professional hazard. She tightened the wrap. You move like the stitches don't exist. They don't matter. They do to me. Thomas looked down at her. Why? Catherine didn't answer immediately. She finished securing the bandage. Then she said quietly, Because if you die, all this was pointless. Thomas stared at her a long moment. Then Victor spoke urgently. Boss. Thomas grabbed his shotgun again. Back to work. The staircase became the next battlefield. 2 gunmen rushed upward. Victor's men fired. 1 attacker fell. The other dove behind the railing. Bullets ripped chunks from the marble steps. Catherine crouched low behind Thomas. Her heart pounded so hard she thought it might burst. The attacker leaned out to fire again. Thomas reacted faster. 1 precise shot, the man collapsed. The gunfire stopped. Smoke drifted through the stairwell. Victor checked the lower floor. Clear. Thomas nodded. Count. Victor spoke into his radio. Status check. Several voices answered. 2 injured. 1 attacker escaped. Victor frowned. Thomas's eyes narrowed. Escaped? Yes. Where? Victor hesitated. Toward the west wing. Thomas turned slowly. The west wing. Catherine suddenly realized something. That leads to the security room. Victor's eyes widened. Oh no. Thomas's expression turned deadly calm. If they reach the server system, Victor finished the thought. They can open the gates, which meant dozens more attackers could enter the property. Thomas looked toward the hallway. Move. They ran. The West Wing corridor was darker. Half the lights had been destroyed during the fighting. When they reached the security room door, it was open. Victor cursed. Inside, the monitors flickered wildly, and one man stood in the center of the room. A familiar face. Catherine recognized him instantly. The mansion's head of internal security, Marcus. Thomas stopped walking. You. Marcus smiled. I was wondering when you'd figure it out. Victor's hand tightened on his pistol. You've been planning this? For months. Marcus turned toward the monitors. Rossi empires don't last forever. Thomas's voice was ice. And you thought you'd take mine. Marcus shrugged. Someone will. Catherine noticed something behind him. A blinking timer on the security console. What's that? She whispered. Marcus heard her. Oh. He smiled wider. That? He pressed a button. Every gate on the property unlocked. Sirens outside began screaming. Victor swore violently. They're opening the gates! Marcus stepped away from the console. Your enemy should arrive any minute now. Thomas didn't move. His eyes never left Marcus. You betrayed me. Marcus shrugged. You built a kingdom of criminals. And? Someone always wants the throne. Thomas raised the shotgun. Unfortunately for you, Marcus pulled a gun of his own. So do I. The room froze. 2 men, 2 guns. Catherine realized something terrifying. Neither of them was aiming at her, but she was standing directly between them. And when the first shot fired, she would be the one caught in the middle. The security room felt smaller than it was. Too many guns, too much tension. Catherine stood frozen between 2 men who ruled their worlds with violence. Thomas Rossi on one side, Marcus on the other. Both holding weapons, both ready to fire. Victor and the remaining guards slowly spread out behind Thomas, trying to angle for a clear shot. But Marcus had positioned himself well. One twitch of his finger, and Catherine would be in the line of fire. Marcus smiled faintly. You should have stayed in bed, boss. Thomas didn't blink. You should have stayed loyal. Marcus laughed quietly. Loyalty doesn't pay. Thomas's voice dropped lower. I paid you very well. You paid me to guard your empire. Marcus gestured toward the flashing monitors. But empires fall. The security screens showed the front gate slowly sliding open. Headlights appeared in the darkness beyond. More cars approaching. Victor looked at the screens and swore under his breath. They're here. Marcus nodded. Right on schedule. Thomas's jaw tightened. You're selling the house to my enemies. Marcus shrugged again. Someone else offered more. Catherine realized something chilling. This wasn't just betrayal. This was a complete takeover. Marcus had planned it carefully. Your empire ends tonight, Marcus said. Thomas remained still. You always were ambitious. Marcus raised his pistol slightly higher. And you always underestimated me. The tension in the room reached its breaking point. Catherine's heart pounded. She knew exactly what would happen next. Someone would shoot, and she would be caught in the middle. Her brain worked fast. Too fast. A strange calm settled over her. She spoke suddenly. You're wrong. Both men looked at her. Marcus frowned. What? You're wrong, Catherine repeated. Marcus scoffed. You're the nurse. Stay quiet. Catherine stepped slightly forward. You didn't think this through. Thomas's eyes flicked toward her. Marcus laughed. I've planned this for 6 months. No, Catherine said calmly. You planned the attack. Marcus's smile faded. But you didn't plan the aftermath. The room grew quiet. Marcus narrowed his eyes. Explain. Catherine gestured toward the monitors. Let's say you kill Thomas. Marcus waited. You take control of the house? Yes. And the empire? Marcus nodded slowly. That's the idea. Catherine tilted her head. And what do you think happens next? Marcus frowned. What do you mean? You think his organization just accepts you? Victor almost smiled. Marcus looked annoyed. They'll have no choice. Catherine shook her head. They absolutely will. Marcus's jaw tightened. Explain. Catherine spoke calmly. You're not the boss's heir. No. You're not even a partner. Marcus stared at her. So once Thomas dies, she paused. Every single lieutenant under him starts fighting you. Victor chuckled softly. Marcus glanced at him. What's funny? Victor shrugged. She's right. Marcus's expression hardened. Catherine continued. You won't inherit the empire. Marcus's voice became sharper. Yes, I will. No. She shook her head again. You'll inherit a war. Thomas watched her carefully. Marcus looked uncertain now. You're lying. No. She gestured toward Thomas. You're powerful because he built loyalty. Marcus looked back at Thomas, then back at Catherine. And you think they won't follow me? Victor answered for her. No. Marcus's smile faded completely. You're bluffing. Catherine shrugged. Maybe. Silence stretched across the room. Then Thomas spoke for the first time in nearly a minute. You really should have shot her immediately. Marcus looked irritated. I was about to. Catherine smiled slightly. But now you're thinking. Marcus's grip tightened on the pistol. Thomas's eyes gleamed with quiet amusement. She does that. Marcus looked between them. The confidence in his face had cracked, and in that single moment of hesitation, Thomas moved. The shotgun fired. Marcus fired at the same time. 2 gunshots exploded through the room. Marcus collapsed backward. Thomas staggered slightly but remained standing. Smoke filled the air. Catherine blinked. Marcus lay motionless on the floor. Victor rushed forward and kicked the gun away. He's done. Thomas lowered the shotgun slowly. Catherine looked at him. You're bleeding again. Thomas glanced down. A thin line of blood ran along his side. Again, he muttered. Catherine grabbed the medical kit instantly. Sit. Thomas sighed. You're very bossy. You're very injured. Victor laughed quietly. That's the most accurate description of him I've heard all year. Catherine cleaned the wound quickly. Bullet grazed you. Thomas winced slightly. I noticed. You're lucky. Victor glanced at the monitors. We're not lucky yet. Thomas looked up. The screens showed cars pulling through the open gates. Headlights filled the driveway. At least a dozen vehicles. Victor swore. That's the Ali Syndicate. Catherine's stomach dropped. You know them? Thomas nodded slowly. They've been trying to take my territory for years. Victor checked his rifle. They're here to finish the job. Catherine finished bandaging Thomas again. You need to leave. Thomas shook his head. No, they'll overwhelm the house. Victor agreed quietly. They brought numbers. Thomas stood slowly. Then he looked at Catherine. You said something interesting earlier. What? You said Marcus planned the attack. Thomas's eyes sharpened. But not the aftermath. Catherine nodded. Yes. Thomas's smile returned. Cold. Dangerous. Good. What are you thinking? Thomas walked toward the security console. Marcus's body still lay beside it. Thomas typed several commands quickly. What are you doing? Victor asked. Thomas didn't look up. Closing the gates. But they're already inside. Yes. Victor's eyes widened slightly. Wait. Thomas pressed the final key. Heavy metal doors slammed shut across the compound, locking every vehicle inside. Catherine looked at the monitors. You trapped them. Thomas nodded. Exactly. Victor started smiling. Oh, that's good. Catherine blinked. How many men do you have here? Victor answered. Enough. Thomas picked up the shotgun again. His voice was calm. Tonight they thought they were hunting me. He checked the weapon. But they walked into my cage. Victor grinned. Catherine stared at the screens. Dozens of armed men stepping out of cars. She looked back at Thomas. "You're going to fight them all?" Thomas looked at her. "No." He smiled slightly. "We are." Catherine blinked. "We?" "You broke the rules." "Yes. You saved my life. Several times." Thomas offered her a small pistol again. This time she didn't hesitate. "Welcome to the war, nurse." Outside, engines roared. Weapons loaded. And the final battle for Thomas Rossi's empire was about to begin. The gates of the Rossi estate slammed shut like the closing of a trap. Steel barriers locked into place. Security lights flooded the grounds. Every exit was sealed. Outside, dozens of armed men from the Alley Syndicate stepped out of black SUVs, realizing too late what had happened. They had not surrounded Thomas Rossi, they had been invited into his fortress. And now they were trapped inside it. Inside the security room, Victor watched the monitors and grinned. "Boss, they look confused." Thomas checked the chamber of his shotgun again. "Confusion is good." Catherine stood nearby, still holding the small pistol Thomas had given her. Her heart was pounding. But something inside her had changed. Fear had turned into focus. "Victor," Thomas said calmly. "Yes. Positions." Victor spoke into the radio. "All units, perimeter lockdown. No one leaves the property." Voices responded immediately. Guards moved across the estate, weapons ready. Outside, the enemy began organizing. Their leader stepped forward, Declan Alley himself. Short, thick-necked, expensive suit, angry eyes. He shouted toward the mansion, "Rossi!" His voice echoed across the courtyard. Thomas watched the screen. He made the trip personally. Victor chuckled. "That's rare." Declan Alley yelled again. "Come out and die like a man." Thomas sighed. "He's dramatic." Catherine looked at the screen. "You're not going out there, are you?" Thomas looked at her. "Of course I am." Victor nodded. "Boss always does." "You're injured." Thomas tilted his head. "You keep mentioning that. Because it keeps being true." Victor smirked. Thomas walked toward the door. "Stay inside." Catherine shook her head. "No!" Thomas stopped. "You're not part of this. I already am." Victor quietly stepped aside. He had learned something about Catherine already. Arguing with her rarely worked. Thomas looked at her again. "You could still leave." Catherine gestured toward the locked gates. "No, I can't." Thomas smiled faintly. "Fair point." The courtyard was lit by harsh, white floodlights. Rain had stopped. Cold wind rolled off the ocean cliffs. Dozens of armed men stood between the vehicles and the mansion. Victor's men took positions along the balconies and walls. Weapons trained. Thomas walked out alone. Catherine and Victor followed a few steps behind. Declan Alley laughed when he saw him. "Well, look who survived." Thomas stopped in the center of the courtyard. "You brought a lot of men," Alley grinned. "I expected resistance." Thomas nodded. "That was wise." Alley glanced at Catherine. "And the nurse." His grin widened. "I wondered if she was real." Catherine felt Thomas's hand tighten slightly at his side. Ali continued. "Funny thing about tonight." "What?" Thomas asked calmly. "You weren't supposed to make it this far." Thomas tilted his head slightly. "That was Marcus's plan." Ali nodded. "Good man." Thomas's eyes flickered briefly toward the mansion. "He's dead." Ali shrugged. "Unfortunate." Victor spoke up. "You drove a long way just to die, Declan." Ali smirked. "You think so?" Thomas watched him quietly. Ali spread his arms. "You've been powerful for a long time, Rossi." "Yes, but power changes hands." Thomas nodded slowly. "Sometimes?" Ali pointed toward Catherine. "You should have stayed a nurse." Catherine raised an eyebrow. "Why?" "Because tonight ends badly for you." Thomas's voice turned cold. You're threatening someone under my protection. Ali laughed. Protection? He gestured toward the men behind him. You're outnumbered. Thomas looked around slowly. Then he said something simple. No. Ali frowned. What? Thomas looked back at him. You're surrounded. Victor pressed a button on his radio. Every guard on the estate stepped into view. Balconies, roofs, garden walls, snipers with rifles trained directly on Ali's men. The realization spread across the courtyard. Ali's men shifted uneasily. Ali's smile faded. You planned this. Thomas shrugged. You walked through the gate. Ali looked furious now. You think this scares me? No. Thomas's voice stayed calm. But it should. Ali raised his gun suddenly. Kill him. Gunfire erupted instantly. The courtyard exploded into chaos. Victor's men fired from elevated positions. Ali's men returned fire from behind vehicles. Catherine dropped behind a stone pillar. Bullets shattered glass and chipped marble. Thomas moved like a machine. Precise. Controlled. Every shot deliberate. Victor covered the east side with a rifle. Ali's men began falling quickly. They had walked into a crossfire. Within minutes the fight was nearly over. Several attackers surrendered. Others lay wounded on the ground. Ali himself stood alone now, gun still raised, breathing hard. Thomas approached slowly. Ali aimed directly at him. You win tonight? Ali growled. But it won't last. Thomas stopped a few feet away. No. Ali smiled grimly. Empires always fall. Thomas nodded. You're right. Ali seemed surprised. Then, Thomas said something unexpected. But they don't have to. Ali frowned. What? Thomas lowered his shotgun. For the first time that night, he didn't look like a warlord. He looked tired. Violence built this empire. Ali sneered. That's the only thing that builds empires. Thomas glanced back at Catherine. Then he looked at Ali again. No! Ali laughed harshly. Then what does? Thomas answered quietly. Choice. Ali scoffed. Choice? Yes. Thomas gestured toward the guards. They follow me because they choose to. Ali's grin twisted. Fear. No. Thomas shook his head. Respect. Ali looked ready to fire. But before he could, sirens filled the night. Police vehicles. Dozens of them. Blue lights flooded the driveway. Ali's face went pale. Thomas looked toward Catherine. She stepped forward calmly. Ali stared at her. What did you do? Catherine shrugged. While you were all planning to kill each other, she nodded toward the security room. I called the authorities. Victor burst out laughing. Ali's jaw dropped. You called the police? Yes. Ali looked furious. You idiot! Catherine tilted her head. Why? They'll arrest him too. Catherine glanced at Thomas, then back at Ali. Not tonight. Ali's eyes widened. What? Victor stepped forward. Marcus recorded everything. Ali looked confused. Catherine explained calmly. The assassination attempt. The conspiracy. The illegal takeover. She nodded toward the security cameras. All documented. Ali realized the truth. You set me up. Thomas smiled faintly. You walked into it. Police officers rushed into the courtyard. Weapons raised. Ali's men dropped their guns. Within minutes, the entire syndicate was in handcuffs. Ali glared at Thomas as officers dragged him away. This isn't over. Thomas watched calmly. It is for you. Hours later, the estate had finally grown quiet again. Police vehicles left. Ambulances carried away the wounded. Victor supervised repairs to the gates. Catherine sat on the balcony overlooking the ocean. Exhaustion washed over her. Footsteps approached. Thomas joined her. He moved slowly. The injuries were catching up to him. Catherine glanced at him. You should be resting. I probably should. They sat in silence for a while. The ocean waves rolled quietly below. Finally, Thomas spoke. You changed everything tonight. Catherine shook her head. I just stopped people from killing each other. Thomas looked at her seriously. You reminded me of something. What? That power isn't the same as control. Catherine smiled faintly. That's a good lesson. Thomas stood slowly. Then something unexpected happened. The most feared Mafia boss in the city knelt in front of her. Catherine blinked. What are you doing? Thomas looked up. For the first time, there was no arrogance in his voice, only honesty. You saved my life. You said that already? No. He shook his head. You saved something else too. What? My choice. Catherine studied him carefully. I built an empire through fear. But tonight, he gestured toward the estate. You showed me another way. Catherine looked out at the ocean. And what happens now? Thomas smiled slightly. That depends on you. She raised an eyebrow. Why? Because the future of this place, he paused, should belong to someone who knows when to break the rules. Catherine laughed softly. You're offering me a job? I'm offering you a choice. Silence filled the balcony again. Finally, Catherine stood. She looked down at him. Stand up, Thomas. He did. What's your answer? He asked. Catherine smiled. My answer? She glanced toward the sunrise beginning to glow over the ocean. Is that power should never belong to one person. Thomas nodded slowly. Then we build something better. Thomas took it. And for the first time in many years, the most dangerous man in the city chose something stronger than fear. He chose the truth. People often believe power belongs to the loudest voice, the richest man, or the most feared leader. But real power is quieter than that. Real power is the courage to speak when silence would be easier. It is the strength to break rules that protect injustice. And sometimes, the person who changes the world isn't a king, a boss, or a general. Sometimes, it's just a nurse who refused to look away. If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, make sure to subscribe for more cinematic stories like this one. Like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and stay tuned for the next tale where courage, truth, and impossible choices collide.